Welcome. Hi, everybody. So my name is Justin Levitt, and I'm a professor of law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. I'll be your moderator this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello there. This Brennan Center for Justice Symposium is called Voting and Representation, New Issues and Challenges. It's a collaboration with the NYU Law Review about the issue of the hour, the urgent need for our upcoming election to be free and fair and accurate. We want to make sure that the voices of all Americans are heard and accounted for. And as this is an election year and we're talking about elections, I want to take a moment to clarify very clearly that the Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan 501c3 and does not participate in elections or endorse or oppose candidates. We have a spectacular expert panel for you today. They're going to examine the lessons that can be learned from the present crisis, the coronavirus pandemic crisis, and in other ways, a crisis of confidence, in order to better protect voting in the long term. So you've already heard today about some of the challenges of voting in the present. We're going to be focused on what those challenges tell us for the future, necessary policy reforms, legal and constitutional theories to strengthen voting rights, and other strategies, including some that may be beyond the courts, for combating political disenfranchisement and voter suppression. Before we tackle any of these issues, it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists to you. And hopefully we can see who they are in just a moment. There we go. Janai Nelson is Associate Director Counsel at the ACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Guy Uriel Charles is the Edward and Ellen Schwartzman Professor of Law at Duke School of Law. And Eliza Swearenbecker is counsel at the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Obviously, there's a lot more that you can learn about each of them and through all of their biographies. It would take the entire hour. But rest assured, you're talking with the experts of the moment and the people who will be our guides into the future. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before I jump in with questions of my own, I want to be clear. We have a big virtual audience today, and we'd love to get a few questions from you all, from the audience. So you can tweet questions to hashtag BrennanLive, BRENNAN live. Or if you're watching on YouTube or on the Facebook stream, go ahead and leave a comment there with questions. We'll take as many as we can during the program. I'll see them, I'll pitch them to our panelists, and they will do their best to answer the questions you have. Also, this is a CLE program, so for those seeking CLE credit for this event, we're going to flash a unique code once every 50 minutes, just so that you can make sure that up and counts for your own CLE. All right, let's jump on in. Hi, everybody. So earlier today, there was a whole panel on the problems that the pandemic has caused, some of the disruption in the election system, how state legislators and how state executives and how local election officials have or have not accommodated those disruptions in standard issue service. We also know that the current election structure has revealed, or for some of us who've seen it for years, brought to the fore some fundamental underlying problems with the elections. How do we fix those? Eliza, we're used to states adjusting their election codes after elections and sometimes before elections and sometimes right before elections. I want to focus on a different actor, one that we're also electing this fall. Everybody's focused on the president, but we're also electing a Congress. What is it that Congress can do to address some of the problems that the pandemic has revealed? What powers do they have? How should they exercise those powers?
Thanks, Justin, and thanks to the NYU Law Review, my colleagues at the Brennan Center, and the virtual audience for joining us today. We often hear the refrain that states are the bodies that have control over election rules, and that's true to a point. States write the rules for their own state elections, and they're required by the US Constitution to write laws that regulate elections too, through a provision known as the Elections Clause. And there is an upside to that. It allows states to design election systems that work best for them and their populations. It allows experimentation with new pro-voter policies, like states with dispersed populations conducting all-mail elections, beginning with Oregon in 1998, or states beginning to adopt AVR, automatic voter registration, again, starting with Oregon in 2015. And this adheres to Brandeis' classic vision of states as the laboratories of democracy. But it also means that states can enact and implement varying policies that are, at best, a confusing patchwork of election administration. And at worst, it gives the opportunity for state lawmakers to enact policies that make it harder for voters to access the ballot box, policies that suppress the vote. And fortunately, turning to what Congress can do, that same provision of the Constitution, the Elections Clause, that directs states to make rules for federal elections, also gives Congress the power to make federal election laws or to even alter the laws that are enacted by states. In essence, the Constitution gives Congress an override button to regulate the times, places, and manner of federal elections. And that's why we've seen federal legislation like the Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act, the Help America Vote Act, to name some of the biggest and most recent federal election reforms in the last several decades. And that federal override button is essential because, as we know, states have a very long history of enacting policies that suppress votes. And it bears underscoring here that without fail, voters of color bear the brunt of voting barriers more than white voters. And this is sometimes the intended outcome from lawmakers. Indeed, after a key provision of the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the 2013 Shelby County decision, states unleashed a flood of legislation that restricted access to the ballot box. And so that brings us to the power that Congress has under the Elections Clause. And the framers gave Congress this override button because they were afraid that state lawmakers were going to manipulate the rules for elections to favor particular parties, disfavor certain kinds of voters. If you look at the debate records from the Constitutional Convention and the ratification in the states, there was a persistent fear from the framers that there would be an entrenchment of political parties in power by state legislatures, that state lawmakers would put polling places in inconvenient locations, draw districts to create disproportionate representation, suppress minority participation, though at the time that referred to political party minorities. And these concerns are very familiar and fresh to the ones that we have today. And starting in 1870, Congress passed the beginning of a series of federal voting rights laws, and those early Reconstruction era laws were called the Enforcement Acts, and they were designed to protect against voter suppression, particularly of newly enfranchised Black men. Over the years, Congress has continued to legislate around voting and elections, and the Supreme Court has upheld the ability of Congress to regulate redistricting, voter registration, campaign finance and corruption, primary elections, recounts, party affiliation rules, balloting. And in each of these cases, the court has remarked on Congress's broad and comprehensive power to regulate federal elections. And Congress may have the opportunity to pass substantial democracy reform legislation next year. Many of the policies that could be at play are the ones that were introduced and passed in the House as part of the For the People Act of 2019, also known as H.R. 1, and the Voting Rights Advancement Act, H.R. 4. H.R. 1, for example, would modernize our voter registration system. We should be making it easier for voters to get registered and update their registration information. We can do that through automatic voter registration, making registration the default rather than forcing voters to opt in when they interact with state agencies. H.R. 1 would implement same-day and online registration as well. H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, would restore the Voting Rights Act and update the Voting Rights Act coverage formula to make sure the Voting Rights Act can operate in full force as it had been prior to 2013. Among other changes that would be possible through Congress and that were introduced and passed through H.R. 1 in the House would be the restoration of voting rights to people with prior convictions. There are many states where citizens living in the community cannot vote because of past convictions. By restoring voting rights, at least in federal elections, to those folks living in our communities, we could eliminate one of the most powerful vestiges of Jim Crow, and we could correct a troubling ruling out of the 11th Circuit last month that allowed the Florida legislature to disenfranchise 775,000 people, turning citizens, unless they pay off legal financial obligations that they cannot afford. So those are just some of the things that Congress can do and that could be on the plate of the next Congress starting next year.
So I suspect we will get back to some more of those details in the conversation to come. Before we do, 2 quick administrative announcements. Remember, a reminder, #BrendanLive with your questions. We want to answer the questions that you have. Also, for people who are getting CLE credit for this event, I've got a code for you. Please record the following code on your sheets in order to verify your attendance. The code is LIRQ3U. That's Lima, India, Romeo, Quebec 3 uniform, LIRQ3U. And for the Russians who are listening, that's your code to get off of the chat and let the rest of us talk. Shania, some of the, I know that LDF has supported congressional legislation, including particularly fervent support of the Voting Rights Advancement Act and restoring the Voting Rights Act. But there are some things that legislation, even powerful congressional legislation, may not be able to fix. Just in the last week, I think, and 2020 has no time anymore, so it's difficult to keep track. We've heard reports of close to 3.5 million African-American voters in Florida targeted for, I believe, deterrence was the word, 2016 campaign. Not engagement, not persuasion, but deterrence. Just, I can't remember whether it was yesterday or 2 days ago now in the debate, our brain has been mush since then. We heard one of the major party candidates not only refuse to stand up against white supremacy, but actively invite white supremacist supporters to stand back and stand by, which was then celebrated across white supremacist blogs and chat groups in the wake of the debate. How do we stop? How do we confront? How do we get to a place where we're in a position to deal with those problems? Can legislation help? Can legislation fix it? And if not, what should we be looking to going forward?
Thanks for that question, Justin. And it's wonderful to be on this panel with so many people whose work I admire. What we saw 2 days ago, two nights ago, was so deeply alarming. I think that we've reached a tipping point in our democracy where the line in the sand has been drawn. We are either headed toward a precipitous descent, or we have an opportunity to rebuild our democracy the way it should have been built from the very beginning. And much of that begins with the upcoming election and getting people to turn out and vote, as well as having legislation that can protect the right to vote and enable people to exercise that fundamental right that is preservative of all rights, as the Supreme Court said, well over a century ago. I will take issue on some level with the idea that legislation cannot protect against some of the rank voter suppression and even voter intimidation that has been invited by one of the lead candidates in this upcoming presidential election and his cronies. We do have legislation that works. We have Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that can be used to prevent voter intimidation. It was expressly enacted to combat that very problem in our elections that stems from our history of racial discrimination when it comes to voting, particularly against African Americans. We also have the Ku Klux Klan Act, which prohibits conspiring against any individual to inhibit the exercise of their constitutional rights and other rights. The Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, the other white supremacist groups that we have seen emerge recently are an extension of the Ku Klux Klan. They are similar extremist, violent groups that threaten the integrity of our elections. And those laws can be used to prevent their action in harming the integrity of our election. We also have in the Voting Rights Act the ability to send federal observers to elections, and that provision too stemmed out of the history of voter intimidation and violence against African Americans in this country. The question is not whether we have adequate legislation. The question is whether we have adequate leadership to enforce that legislation, to protect the right to vote. Of course, we do need the fixes that Eliza mentioned. They are integral to restoring some of the protections that were lost in the Shelby County versus Holder case in 2013. We absolutely want the For the People Act to be enforced. I mean, to become law and to be fully enforced. We want the Voting Rights Advancement Act, named after the late and legendary John Lewis, to be passed and enforced. But we won't be able to get there if we don't have the ability to exercise the right to vote free and unfettered in this upcoming election. And so the first order of business is to make it known that we have protections against voter intimidation, and we expect the leaders of this country, including the Department of Justice, which is the top law enforcement agency of this country, to enforce the laws fairly, equally, and aggressively to prevent voter intimidation at the polls.
Fair enough, and an excellent point. Yeah, I didn't want to suggest that we have no tools at present. We have some, and they're quite powerful if they're enforced properly, to your point. Guy, so let me ask you, beyond the tools that we have today, beyond not only the legislation we have today, but the current constitutional structure for examining the right to vote and for making sure that the right to vote is free of racial discrimination, how might we reorient our thinking about what it is we're aiming to stop here in a way that protects even beyond some of the very important protections that Janai has mentioned?
Yeah, so first let me just express my thanks to the organizers of this symposium, and also express my admiration for my co-panelists, Janai, Justin, and Eliza, I've been colleagues with Justin and Janai for many years and love their work. And I'm just meeting Eliza, and I've followed her work. So I just want to express my admiration for all three of you. And to answer Justin's question, so there are two things that I think we want to think about here. The first is the fact that we have a political and constitutional structure that does not reward political participation. In many respects, our voting system is a war of attrition. It seems to be determined to reward disincentivizing political participation as opposed to incentivizing political participation. And so for just a couple moments, I want to point out what the fundamental structures are and why it is that we have a system that disincentivizes political participation is really more of a war of attrition than one in which you are rewarded and expected to engage and to create, to grow the electorate. So the first thing to recognize is that our constitutional structure does not provide us with a federal positive right to vote. So you really, sort of notwithstanding sort of the brilliant frameworks that we have from our co-panelists on both the existing laws and Congress's powers. So Janai pointed out the existing tools, and Liza pointed out Congress's powers, right? But there's still a deficiency within our constitutional system. So take the South Africa Constitution, which is one of my favorite examples, where it provides that every adult citizen has the right to vote in elections for any legislative body. So our system does not have anything resembling that framework. And the best that it has is, Article 1, Section 2, the electors of each state shall have the qualifications of the electors of the numerous branches, which basically presupposes the role of the states and relies upon the states to frame the electorate. And the most relevant parts of our Constitution with respect to voting addresses voting as a negative right. So the 15th Amendment, the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race. 19th on sex, 24th on poll tax. So the idea is, look, where the voting is granted, you can't deny it on the basis of race or on the basis of sex or on the basis of of age or imposing a poll tax, but it doesn't. We don't have either a culture or a constitutional framework in which one can point to and to say, hey, here's where the Constitution says, as in the First Amendment, for example, that Congress shall not, or the government should, as the court has interpreted, abridge freedom of speech and press. Okay, so that's one. The second thing is, as the folks on the panel know, we have a system that is deeply decentralized. Federalism is a key component of it. We depend and rely upon the states for both voting practice as well as for voting laws. The states are the first movers in election law issues and sometimes the only movers. And not only is it decentralized at the state level, but it's also localized. So, right, not just 50 different systems, but hundreds of different systems. So it makes it really hard to centralize voting practices and to say, look, here are the best sets of practices, or to make sure that that jurisdictions are not minimizing the right to vote or making it really hard, because there are just a lot of different types of practices to keep track of, and without sort of the centralized framework, uniform sets of practices, people's voting experiences differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, sometimes from one precinct to the other, much less from one city or county or state to the other. And then a couple other points that are worth making. One is that there are too few professionals in the process. So we don't have a system that is replete with professional government employees to administer voting. I mean, imagine, you know, the way that we do voting in our country. Imagine that we did the same thing with sort of with health or with environmental laws, where we rely on volunteers to go out and get samples, for example, right, and then to send those samples to the labs, right, to follow up on that analogy. It wouldn't surprise us that if we wouldn't have a great environmental science or system, because of the way that it relies upon non-professionals to do that type of work. And then relatedly, we rely upon voters to bear the burden of political participation. The government doesn't take responsibility for it. So this is one of the points, for example, that Eliza is making with respect to HR1. One of the things that HR1 would do is it shifts the burden of political participation from the individuals, from nonprofit groups, to the government. And so then that makes it easier for people to vote. And of course, there's the partisan administration of elections. So when you take all of those things, and then you add the fact that basically what we have is the judiciary as administrators of enforcers, right? Litigation as the primary mechanism, you can see why we have the type of a system that we currently have. And of course, if you add a global pandemic, once in 100 years global pandemic, it's very clear then what our processes look like and why the system is dysfunctional. So if we want to change the system, right, if we want to improve upon some of these questions and some of these problems, what we have to do is address the deep rootedness of the deficiency, right? And it begins with understanding that whether as a matter of political culture, whether as a matter of norm, whether as a matter of law, whether as a matter of constitutional law, that voting and political participation ought to be viewed truly, not sort of in sometimes the language that we use, but truly as a fundamental right, and that we ought to create structures around it that then makes its exercise easier and does not treat voting as something that is exceptional. Well, yes, if the government denies it to you on the basis of race or makes it harder for you on the basis of race, sometimes we might care. But really to view it as a core element of citizenship and to make it as easy to engage and to participate as we do so many other things that we view as core elements of citizenship. So let me stop there, but I think that gives us a way to think about why we have the problems that we have and what are the types of things that we would need to do to fix it.
So thank you for that. I'm going to return to you to elaborate and then work around the panel in a different order. And while I do that, just another reminder, hashtag Brennan Live or send questions in the comments through YouTube and Facebook. We want to hear what you want to hear about this discussion. So you're very specifically calling out or calling for a reorientation of the way we think about voting fundamentally. It sounds like it comes not primarily from the courts, not primarily from litigation, but from a change in perhaps Congress centralizing legislation or perhaps political culture. Are there good examples in the past of congressional statutes that don't just get watered down, that actually reset political culture from the federal government?
Mhm.
And do we have the conditions in the country to get those sorts of statutes now? Or are we just going to end up with something that's sort of mushily in the middle with compromise that tinkers around the edges with the election rules, but doesn't really reset political culture in the way that you're envisioning?
Sure, thank you. So the second part of your question is actually the hardest one, right? Which is where are we going? Do we have the political will to do the type of things that it is that we're trying to do? So that actually is difficult. Now, part of it depends upon the political process, right? What happens in next few weeks? What happens in the next 4 years? All of those things matter. But we can take a lesson from the Voting Rights Act that Janae has talked about on this panel. One of the things that the Voting Rights Act did is that it reset the political culture. So, for example, today we no longer have literacy tests, but we used to have them in lots of states, in many states, including the state of New York. Right, so the Voting Rights Act reset the political culture, but in order to do that, the reason why I was able to do that is because there was essentially unified government. The Democratic Party had an internal war. The good people won. And so the political process then was able to come together and pass a fairly strong legislation that, though parts of it are no longer operative, but it did reset the political culture. And, as I said, one very good example of it is the fact that we don't have literacy tests, the fact that we don't have poll taxes, right? There are ways in which our political practices are so much better. And some of that is as a function of statutes like the VRA, as a function of even beginning with the enforcement acts, for example, that Eliza talked about. So we have good examples, and I think, but it really does depend on the political process, making the arguments for where we need to go and getting the legislative process in play.
A vision for what we all should be doing starting on January 3rd, or starting now to talk to our representatives starting January 3rd. Janae made the point earlier, though, that we have some existing tools, and that while this fight is not an either or, but a both and, those existing tools do allow for change to proceed not only through Congress, not only through new legislation, not only through gaining political momentum through the legislative process, but also through the courts. There have been a number of successes in the courts, including those that reset norms and expectations, with judges talking about what they see and what they think is unjust and fair, and what violates the existing statutes and constitutional protections we've got. And we've also seen litigation run into some roadblocks with doctrines that aren't quite up to the task just yet. So, Janae, if I can ask you to talk about where you've seen litigation this cycle that proves a model for litigation going forward, right? Some of the stuff where judges have responded to the existing claims, and also maybe some of the places we've seen problems that it's going to take new doctrine or new judges to think through.
That's a great question, Justin. We are very pleased in many instances in how judges have responded in the midst of the pandemic and the particular pressures that it has put on our election system and the threat that it has posed to voters. The Legal Defense Fund has litigated in the states of Louisiana and South Carolina and Alabama and many places throughout the South. We are engaged in a voter election protection effort, a voting rights defense project, and a Prepared to Vote campaign to incentivize voters to exercise their right to vote and to do it safely. But we have used the courts to help change some of the laws that are particularly pernicious in the midst of this pandemic. we were fortunate just yesterday to receive a favorable outcome in a case in Alabama in which we challenged the requirement of voters to have 2 witnesses to mail in their absentee ballots and to provide a copy of a government issued ID as part of that balloting process, recognizing that many of the individuals who choose to vote by mail are doing so because they have particular risks when it comes to their health in connection with the possibility of contracting the coronavirus. And so to impose a requirement that they have 2 witnesses or that they have to make a copy of a voter ID may not seem like much of a burden to some, but it can be a life-threatening exercise to others. And we know that the coronavirus has had a disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx communities, with Black and Latinx communities 2 times as likely to die from it and 3 times as likely to contract it. So with the overlay of those threats, we have pushed back on these requirements for mail-in voting. And we are pleased, although the state of Alabama already filed its notice of appeal, we are pleased that judges have recognized this particular and unique threat and have ruled in our favor to uphold the voting rights of voters in the states of Alabama, to expand early voting in Louisiana, for example. It also allows for counties in Alabama to offer curbside voting to ease the burden on the election system and to allow voting to be safer. So there are some bright spots in all of this, despite the bleak outlook in many respects. But we also know that there are very disconcerting laws around voter purges. I think Eliza already mentioned the very disappointing outcome in the 11th Circuit in the case involving Amendment 4, where Florida voters passed an amendment to their constitution 2 years ago with a 2/3 vote, 65% of the electorate saying that they want returning citizens to be able to exercise their right to vote, and only to have the state legislature interpret that amendment in a way that ultimately forces these returning citizens to pay a poll tax in order to exercise their right to vote, to pay all past fines and fees. And so that is quite discouraging. So if you ask about, laws that are a significant barrier to voting rights and that also have a ripple effect in the communities beyond the particular individual, the communities that they inhabit, I would say that felon disenfranchisement is one of the most pernicious laws that remains and is a significant barrier. We know that it's rooted in a white supremacist, racist ideology to keep African Americans from the poll. If you look at the origins of almost any of those laws, you will come across the rhetoric that animated the law and its rife suppression and voter suppression. And so those laws are particularly problematic, in addition, as I said, to the voter purge laws that protect voters and protect election officials when they purge voters for failing to exercise their right to vote. So there are a number of legal barriers that remain, but we are encouraged that there are some courts that do see voter suppression for what it is, that do see the barriers to voting in this pandemic and are willing to act appropriately in enforcing the laws against them.
I've got another question that I really want to ask Eliza, but before I let you go, Janae, talk a little bit about the litigation calendar, if you would. So we're, a month out from the election, and as you mentioned, one of the cases just appealed to the 11th Circuit, and so we like to think that the rules are stable, but they're still a little bit shifting. You've mentioned successes that we've had, but that still takes litigation in a hurry and in suboptimal conditions. So how does the calendar of an election year litigation affect the amount or the degree or the timeliness of the justice that you're able to achieve even when you get it?
Yeah, this is one of the most litigious elections that we've ever witnessed. There are suits, not just the ones that I mentioned that the Legal Defense Fund has brought, but our colleagues, the ACLU, the Brennan Center, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and many others are litigating and doing it as quickly as we possibly can. We filed suit much earlier in the year when we saw the devastating impact of the pandemic and sought to get relief in advance of primary elections, not just the November election, in advance of primary elections. But as we move closer to Election Day, we are concerned about voting changes, which is why we do need the legislation that we've been discussing. That's why we need the Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act. The For the People Act actually deters jurisdictions from enacting laws and changes close to the election. And that's the type of protection that we had under Section 5 in many jurisdictions across the country, where a voting change would have to be pre-cleared before it could go into effect. Now it's, there's really no barrier to having election officials adopt a new law that could affect and impact an election leading up to the election, and it requires emergency litigation. And once the election happens, you can't unring that bell. So there really is a significant time pressure to make sure that we get to court quick and fast, and that judges act quickly, and that we try to seek justice and establish what the rules of the game are in advance of the election, so that voters are well prepared and educated about their rights, and that the laws are very clear.
Thank you. Just another reminder to the audience, hashtag Brennan Live if you've got a question, or in the comments and chats on Facebook and YouTube. Eliza, so back to you. Janae just mentioned some of the, let's call it defensive work that federal legislation can do in stopping bad things from happening. Guy pointed earlier to a need to really move to offense, to establish fundamental rights that affirmatively protect and lift up, that promote people's ability to vote rather than defending against bad stuff. I know that you mentioned the For the People Act and some of the provisions in there, but it's an opportunity to take a little bit of a deeper dive. What are some of the more important provisions that you see moving from defense to offense in affirmatively lifting up the sort of voting we should all want moving forward?
Well, I think to pick up on something that Guy said about the culture that we have around voting and the burden that is placed on the voter to get registered or update their voter registration. If automatic voter registration were enacted in all of the states that don't already have it, that would mean approximately 50 million Americans would get registered to vote. That is a great way to change the political culture, because when you're registered to vote, you get the postcard about where your polling place is. You get reminders about when the election is. You get sample ballots. It helps people get engaged in the process of voting and be a participant in their civic community. I think as Janae said, restoring the right to vote to people with felony convictions would restore the right to vote to millions and millions of Americans who are being told when they get released from prison or released from supervision that they're not full participants in our democracy yet. And that's not a message that we want to be sending to citizens who have done their time and who want to participate and want to engage in their communities. We've talked a bit about voter intimidation and the rhetoric that we heard from the president recently. The For the People Act would also create additional protections against deceptive practices like the misinformation that we've been hearing. For example, there would be increased criminal penalties for false and misleading statements, as well as for intimidation aimed at impeding or preventing somebody from voting or registering to vote. The deceptive practices provisions would empower citizens to go to court to stop voter deception, and would blunt the effect of deceptive information by requiring designated government officials to disseminate accurate, correct information to voters. We've also heard about flawed voter purges. Just last year, hundreds of thousands of voters were removed from the rolls in Georgia on the basis of a change in their residency, but research has shown that they didn't actually move. And the For the People Act would place limits on states' use of data compiled through interstate cross-checks to purge eligible voters from the rolls. What we see with flawed purges like the one in Georgia is that the data is not good enough. And so we need additional checks on what election administrators are allowed to do, what kind of data they're allowed to rely on. The For the People Act would also, include redistricting reform, election security, campaign finance, and ethics reforms as well. But I think one of the things that we have alluded to over the course of the conversation that is not part of HR 1, but that is sorely needed, is leadership that encourages voter participation. You mentioned earlier today that there is a crisis in confidence among some voters. And that's true. There were nearly 100 million Americans who were eligible and didn't cast a vote for president in 2016. And about 38% of them said that they weren't confident that elections would represent the will of the people. We have to be clear that what determines the outcome of elections in this country are the voters going to the polls or sending in their ballots, and encourage participation. And that needs to come from our leadership as well, and from advocates who can push back against these false claims of voter fraud that are intended to undermine the confidence of voters in the election. A big shift in the culture of voting has to come from the representatives and the leaders who have the bully pulpit and can encourage people to participate.
So let me follow up on that, and this may be for anybody who wishes. One of the constitutional provisions that we've been talking about giving the federal government the right to legislate is the Elections Clause, right? The Congress can set the rules of federal elections if they wish. And some of the other laws that we've been talking about, like the Voting Rights Advancement Act, are based not only on that, but also on the 14th and 15th Amendment right to protect voting against unconstitutional disenfranchisement or disenfranchisement on the basis of race or language status. One of the questions from the audience, and thank you for those, keep them coming, points to a different part of the Constitution and wonders, one, whether it might not be an even broader affirmative grant to Congress to really reinforce voting rules that preserve confidence in the electoral process, but also wonders whether there might be challenges to congressional use of that clause. It's a guarantee clause. So the Constitution guarantees to each state a republic and a Republican form of government, not Republican capital R, but Republican small r. And Congress has the right to enforce that particular provision, just like it has the right to enforce all of the guarantees, make laws necessary and proper to effectuating all the guarantees in the Constitution. What would it look like if congressional legislation took the guarantee clause seriously? And might that be an alternative or an additional route to legislation that really accomplished the sort of forward-looking, uplifting, confidence-inspiring reforms that you've each talked about? Anybody who wishes.
Well, I'll just jump in brief. Oh, sorry, Guy, go ahead.
No. Go ahead, Eliza, please.
I was just going to jump in briefly to say that if we need to bootstrap federal election reform with a bunch of constitutional bases, that's great. But I just think there's no real question about the power that Congress has to regulate elections under the Elections Clause. It is extremely broad. It has been interpreted very broadly by the Supreme Court without fail for hundreds of years. And that's the breadth of the language of the Elections Clause was exactly what the framers intended. Indeed, they called the Elections Clause words of great latitude. They wanted Congress to be able to regulate federal elections as needed to protect voters. If we want to rely on other provisions of the Constitution, well, the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Guarantee Clause, terrific. But I am not concerned about the constitutionality of federal election regulations because I think the authority is well-founded.
Please, Janae.
No, just say I couldn't agree more. I think Eliza is spot on. I'm always for anchoring legislation in the Constitution and expanding the way we interpret our democracy and what it means to live in a representative democracy and a Republican form of government. So to the extent that the Guarantee Clause amplifies the need for a right to vote to really animate how we define our democracy, that's fine. I don't mind expanding Congress's authority to be able to expand the right to vote and to give it more breadth and depth. But as Eliza points out, Congress really has great latitude already and has shown that. And it's just striking how much has changed in the 14 years, or I guess 16 years, 14 years since the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. And Congress then, by an overwhelming vote in the House, passed the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. It was unanimous in the Senate. And then we find ourselves, just a short period of time later, struggling to get Congress to pay attention to any form of voting rights legislation. And it has the wherewithal, it has the constitutional authority to do it now. And I think it should be exercising that regardless of how we interpret other principles of the Constitution.
One thing that I would like to point out, and I agree with both of those analyses, is that whether the guarantee clause might focus our attention on what is going on at the state level. So just to provide some easy examples, it's hard to look at the state of political participation at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century and through the 1960s, right, until the Voting Rights Act was implemented, and look at many of the states in the South and to say that these were in fact representative governments, right? They were oligarchies. They weren't representative governments. They didn't truly represent their people, particularly when you had many jurisdictions in which, some states in which less than 50% of the voters were voting and participating, right? Less than 50% of the eligible folks were voting and participating. And even in our current modern period, when we're talking about heights of 60, 70%, right? It is hard to fully think about those and say that they're complete representative democracy, that they're in fact republics, and if we think about the role that everyone must play and that people are either descriptively represented or substantively represented, right? That's those. Looking at the numbers, we can hesitate, and certainly in the mid 60s, we're definitely hesitating to say that these were representative institutions, even by minimal standards definitions of representation. So I think what the guarantee clause does is not only does it say, look, Congress, you have a role to play here, but it might also focus our attention on the states. To the extent that the original constitutional design assumed that the states were going to take full responsibility for enfranchising their people, right? And that what you were going to have were competing sovereigns. But if you don't have competing sovereigns, if one sovereign has decided that they aren't interested in representing and providing participation for some or most of their folks, or a large percentage of them, then that undermines the original design, and you could view the guarantee clause as a safety valve that focuses our attention back on the state.
So that in some ways is a perfect segue to another audience question we got. You pointed out that we celebrate turnout when we are somewhere between 50 and 60%. We applaud and clap our hands and suggest that that's a good turnout nationally. And you pointed out the serious deficiencies in being satisfied with that. Why not push for closer to 97, 98, 99? So other Anglo-American countries have adopted systems of mandatory voting. And even if under-enforced, it seems like that might be a way to set a norm or change the political culture in the sorts of ways that you've suggested, Keith. And I don't mean to put favoring or disfavoring that policy in your mouth, but wouldn't adopting legislation encouraging or establishing mandatory voting be one way to change the political culture to really more truly embrace each state having a republic, having a representative democracy? And or would there be problems under the existing constitutional structure in doing that?
Yeah, there might be problems with the existing constitutional structure, and we can talk about that in a minute. But one of the first places to think about, though, is how inconsistent that is, quite frankly, with our political culture, right? You have a hard time getting people to wear masks to save their lives, right? Like sort of imagine then the debate that we would have trying to get people to show up at the polls. We haven't tried the things that we ought to try first. So we know that when we, Eliza mentioned this, when you make it easy for people to vote, automatic voter registration, early voting, right? When you change a mail-in ballot, when you make it easy for people to participate, you increase political participation. When you give an incentive to the parties and the electoral structure, you increase political participation. When people see deliverables, if I vote and my party wins, I get substantive benefits, you increase political participation, right? We haven't fully committed to any of those easy devices. And for me, until we commit to those devices, I would try that first before thinking about something resembling even a soft mandatory, especially in the context of the American culture, in which anything that resembles mandatory becomes itself completely polarized and in some senses self-defeating.
Can I jump in there, Justin?
Please.
Yeah, I think he is right. There's so much that we've left on the table already. But another way to think about it is, would universal voting, mandate or necessitate other reforms? And it's a way of forcing states to meet that demand. And so I absolutely agree that our culture of individual liberty and freedom would be challenged by any mandatory voting scheme. But I think a lot of that can be fixed in terms of how it is constructed, whether it allows for simply participation, not necessarily casting a ballot, but that you at least need to show up or engage in the electoral process, even if it is a no vote. But there's a way in which you as a citizen have a duty to participate in the electoral process. And I can commend to the viewers an excellent report. I will in full transparency confess that I contributed to it, and am in support of universal voting. And it was one that was produced with a number of advocates through the Brookings Institution and the Ash Center at Harvard. And it's called Lift Every Voice. And it advocates for universal voting in a very lenient way, being very cognizant of what was my strongest concern, that this doesn't ultimately become another mechanism for inflicting harm on traditionally marginalized communities like African Americans and Latinx folks. So I think it strikes a very good balance of incentivizing reform and yet protecting against any backlash in cultural norms, and also in terms of perpetuating further criminalization of marginalized communities.
Justin, can I just get into support
sorry,
of
go ahead.
that Janae just made too, where she started, which is also the fact that this conversation might also point out what are the types of things that are needed, right? Or what's missing, and that's a wonderful point, Janae, and I take that.
Thank you.
Eliza.
To jump onto that point, some of the reforms that we talk about, early voting, automatic voter registration, same-day registration, what they're doing is shifting the burden, shifting the costs from the voter to the election administrators. And we should be doing that. But in terms of the needs, what we need to do to make that happen, state election officials and local election administrators need the funding to undertake those costs, to take the cost back from the voter and administer elections properly and smoothly. And we saw in the primaries, with a massive surge in mail voting, that state and local election administrators largely weren't prepared for that much participation for the vote by mail system. So when we do have more participation, the state and locals who are responsible for running the elections don't have the funding to shift the cost back to them. And it is the voters who suffer, who bear the burden of trying to figure out what the ballot receipt deadline is, who suffer from delays in the postal service, who suffer from polling place closures because there aren't enough poll workers to staff the polling places during a primary. So I think we absolutely need to shift the cost from the voter to the state and the federal government through policy. But if we're going to do that, and we need to fund them. And this year, Congress declined to fund election administrators to the tune of the $3.4 billion additional dollars they need to administer elections during the pandemic. That's just really unacceptable, especially when we hear politicians clamoring about problems with elections. If you identify a problem, fix it. Put the money where your mouth is and give election administrators the tools that they need to run an election during the pandemic and in all elections going forward.
So I've got two more questions from the audience, and then we are running swiftly toward the close of our program. First for you, one of the most powerful voices we've had over the last 30 years in breaking down barriers to voting at the ballot box was that of Justice Ginsburg. And even when she was not writing majority opinions, she was speaking loudly and clearly about the need to break down unjustified barriers for everybody, for every eligible voter, but particularly for racial and language minorities. Now that she is unfortunately no longer with us and no longer sitting in that powerful position on the court, where do we find the voice who will be speaking up? And hopefully, where do we find the voice in court majorities, plural? Because it's not always the Supreme Court, as Janae's mentioned. There's an awful lot of litigation success in the lower courts. Where do we find the voices to help reestablish and help set the political climate so that we all become more attuned to and accustomed to breaking down the barriers?
That's a really tough question, Justin, especially considering where we are in terms of the domination process. The reality is, look, what is it? Next Monday, the court will open. It'll be the first Monday in October, the first session of this SCOTUS, and a seat will be empty, or at least a virtual seat will be empty, and that loss is quite palpable. Justice Ginsburg became the notorious RBG when she wrote the dissent in Shelby County and rightly pointed out that throwing out preclearance is like throwing out an umbrella because you're not getting wet. She was just so incisive and plain and just laying out what some of the threats to our democracy are when we take away these needed protections. So I'm very worried, and I don't know how that void will be filled. As you already pointed out, often her voice was one of dissent. It made a difference in terms of explaining why certain decisions were wrong, but ultimately, could not hold sway in a court that was already stacked in a particular direction. Depending on the outcome of current events, we don't know what will happen going forward. But I do hope that we can restore that perspective to the court. It is incredibly needed, particularly as we head toward an election that is likely to be very contentious and may require the court's intervention.
Yeah, I think that Janae's certainly right. This points out sort of the core substance of the conversation we've been having, which is that we have a political and constitutional culture that has not yet fully embraced voting as a fundamental right, no matter what we might say about it sometimes in the law, right? And that's reflected on the court. Now, I'm optimistic. We have Justice Sotomayor and we have Justice Kagan. Justice Kagan's dissent in the Rucho case is a very good example of other justices lifting up their voice and articulating why rights of political participation are important and why structures that undermine, dilutes, or denies those rights are inconsistent with our constitutional framework. But the reality, so in terms of making the argument, they'll be there. But as all of you have said, so far, more often than not, it has been a losing argument at the Supreme Court. Now, you all have also pointed out, and Janae pointed out in particular, how lower courts so far are holding on, and that's really important. Lawyers on the ground are doing a great job of making those arguments and bringing the right sets of cases. So so I'm much more interested in hearing what people like Janae and Liza and you, Justin, former DOJ official, have to say about sort of what can happen on the ground, right? Because it seems like there are successes that are happening on the ground, even though one can't expect the Supreme Court to deliver or save in the way that perhaps one might have hoped for.
So we've got only a tiny amount of time left, and I want to just, before we lose that very tangible on the ground feel, I know we've been talking about the future, I want to leave people with some information about what they can do right now, because as you've all mentioned in different ways, we've got an election. We've got an election that's going on currently. So Janae in particular, I know that LDF has been part of an election protection coalition that is helping right now. If people have concerns or questions or just want to get engaged, what can they do tangibly?
Yeah, we have a microsite that we've launched, voting at naacpldf.org, that is really a one-stop shop for all information that you might need around voting, and it provides ways to volunteer to help defend our election as part of a broader election protection coalition, as well as an opportunity to sign up as a poll worker, which I cannot underscore how important that is this election. The pandemic has reduced the force of poll workers in this country drastically, and we need at least 250,000 additional poll workers to make this election function properly. So, you know, as Guy pointed out, we're relying on volunteers to help power one of the most important elements of our democracy. And until that changes, as he suggests it should, we do need volunteers to come out and power the polls. So you can also go directly to powerthepolls.org and sign up to be a poll worker. And of course, make sure you're registered to vote, check your voting status, and also encourage everyone in your networks to vote and turn out early and make sure that your voice is heard in this election. Did we lose Justin?
I think we may have lost Justin. I will only add to what Janae has said to encourage people not just to participate in this election, which absolutely they should, but to participate in movements for democracy reform. The way that we got the Voting Rights Act, the way that Amendment 4 was passed in Florida is organizing a movement. And change in policy requires government officials to know and understand what citizens want. So make your voices heard at the polling place and participate in the civic community by organizing for democracy reform.
Well,
I think with that will do it for the program. Thank you so much, NYU Law Review, NYU, my colleagues at the Brennan Center. Thanks so much to those of us who have joined us. We really appreciate your participation and your questions, and vote, vote, vote.